I have always been a massive fan of traditional fantasy. Dragons, elves, dwarves, quests, all of that is right up my alley. And although I grew up reading quite a lot of the genre, I completely missed the books set in D&D worlds. Now, I have rectified that a bit in recent years. I have read a few Forgotten Realms books and really enjoyed them. But I have always heard fantastic things about Dragonlance, particularly the early books. I know they were really formative for a lot of classic fantasy readers. So I may have missed them so far, but I am making up for that this week. Welcome to my journey into Dragonlance. I am reading the books, at least to begin with, in chronological order, which means I am starting with Dragons of Autumn Twilight by Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss. I honestly don't know what to expect from these books. I have read only the very barest synopses. I'm pretty much going off the traditional fantasy covers, but I am a whole 10% into the first book and I am enjoying it so far. We meet a band of adventurers who are coming back together to fulfill an oath. They have all been off adventuring and looking into dark forces rising in their world. They are now reporting back, but they have just run into trouble. So that is where we are starting this reading vlog. 10% of the way in, I have got my trusty e-reader. Let the journey begin. Good morning. We are back at home today after our walk through the woods yesterday. There is something about being out in the woods or being up in the hills that definitely feels like being plunged into a fantasy novel. So that was a really nice way to kind of expand my Dragonlance experience this week. Now, as for the book itself, I am nearly 30% of the way through. In my e-reader copy, I am up to page 114. I am really enjoying the story so far. There are definitely echoes of Tolkien, sometimes more overt than others, but I haven't found them too overbearing. They are more general things. The fact that we have a party of adventurers, the fact that they are fleeing, some minor things about the way that creatures are described and landscapes are described. They definitely remind me of The Lord of the Rings, things, but it feels more like an homage to a favourite book, which I think is true of a lot of classic fantasy. And I'm really enjoying the characters. I like the dynamic between them. I like the fact that they knew each other before the book started. That just gives a bit of an interesting twist to the dynamics of the party. So I am enjoying the story. I can't really predict where it is going to go, other than that the quest is going to continue. There is going to be a journey involved, lots of peril and danger. That is exactly what I was looking for. I did want to talk a little bit about my one quibble with the book so far, and this is a quibble that extends to a lot of classic fantasy. A lot of fantasy books in this vein and of this era have a habit of categorizing entire races or communities together. So for example, in Dragonlance, so far I will say, obviously this might change in the future, all goblins are evil, all hobgoblins are ugly. They literally smell of fish, and the ugliness and the smell is all part and parcel of them being evil, morally corrupt, and the enemy. Now I think modern fantasy has drifted away from this concept a little bit, and for good reason. Stereotyping an entire race, even a fantasy one, is dangerous, and it's not something that I would want to see modern writers doing to this extent. We have, of course, the issue that certain fantasy races are very closely aligned with real-world nations or societies, and so that any stereotype you make about the fantasy race sort of drifts over into the real-world communities. But then, of course, there are other ways that stereotypes can be harmful. We see a lot in action films particularly. Anyone with any kind of facial scarring or disfigurement is automatically a villain. Hollywood has not done a good job of moving away from that stereotype, but it's just an example of how grouping everyone together based on where they are from or what they look like can be incredibly harmful. Dragonlance so far has been doing that a bit, as I was talking about with the goblins, but of course I am only 30% of the way through, and there is a chance it will redeem itself later on. There are many Dragonlance books, and this is only the start of a very long journey. So I would be really interested to see if some of the later books break through some of the stereotyping of individual groups to give them a bit more nuance. So it is now Saturday morning. I am looking forward to reading more of Dragons of Autumn Twilight over the weekend. I will say I'm really hoping for some mention of dragons soon, because we haven't had much of that apart from in a historical context. But I'm really liking the main party of characters. I like the way they play off one another, and I'm really intrigued to see where their journey takes them. I am now over 70% of the way through Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and there is so much packed into this book. There is action and adventure. We have had dragons, we have had dwarves, we have had elves. The pace is really non-stop, and I am definitely enjoying it. There have still been a few events and relationships which feel like they map a little too directly onto The Lord of the Rings, but maybe without the gravitas of Tolkien. There are also so many characters in the book now, and I think sometimes the group scenes where all the characters are talking together do groan a bit under the weight of having so many people to have their say. Some of them do get a bit left out at times. But these are really minor quibbles. I'm very much enjoying the world. It feels quite nostalgic, despite the fact I have never read any Dragonlance before. It just reminds me so much of the classic fantasy I read when I was about 13 or 14. I'm still really enjoying the characters and the relationships between them. Like I said, some have had more development than others. I do feel some have been a little shortchanged by the plot so far, particularly Flint and Tasselhoff, whose name I still cannot take seriously, are at times relegated to comic relief, which I think is a bit unfair to them, because I think there could be more depth in their characters than the plot has really had time to develop. But the story as a whole is fantastic. It is, as I said, non-stop. There are moments when the characters are given time to think and reflect and talk, but there is so much action in between. There is also, of course, a journey and a quest, but unlike some fantasy books I've read, it doesn't feel gratuitous. The characters are moving from place to place for plot reasons, not because the authors wanted to explore a fantasy map. So the whole book is really well constructed, really easy to read, really fast paced, and it has given me some big surprises so far, which I love in classic fantasy, which can feel a little bit predictable when you've read a lot of it. I have no idea where the last 30% of the book is going to go. Our heroes are just gearing up for a big mission, but I am almost certain it is going to go wrong, and I can't wait to see how the story ends. I have officially finished Dragons of Autumn Twilight, so I wanted to give a big update on my thoughts at the end of the book. Now, overall, they were very positive. This was such a fast-paced story. It kept moving from location to location. It was never boring. It certainly does make use of some of the tropes and cliches of classic fantasy, but in a lot of ways that was what I was looking for with Dragonlance, so that's not really a failing in my view. I enjoyed the story, I enjoyed the characters, and my quibbles are pretty minor. For example, by the end of the book there really are a lot of characters, and I would venture to say too many. Our core cast has grown by several new characters by the final third of the book, and it does become a little bit overwhelming. Some of the main characters don't really get much of a chance to shine, and I'm sure they will get their chance in later books in the trilogy, but I would have liked to have seen perhaps a few less characters at the end of this first volume to give them more time in the spotlight each. There is also, because this is the first book in a trilogy, a certain lack of resolution at the end of this book. I think you do expect that going into a trilogy. It's not too much of an issue for me, but there is definitely a sense that the plot and the war is really only just getting going. So my overall thoughts are, if you were looking for a classic piece of 80s fantasy, you can't go far wrong with Dragons of Autumn Twilight. I really enjoyed it. Tropes, cliches, and quests galore. I did want to round out the video though with some spoiler thoughts. So if you're not worried about being spoiled for the plot, or if you have read this book already, stick around. Now, I mentioned that I felt there were too many characters by the end of this book, and the biggest letdown for me was the introduction of the character Eben. Now, he is an associate of Giltharnas. They pick him up along the journey. He's a human fighter, and it is quickly introduced that he might be a traitor serving the enemy. We then get this thread running through the last quarter of the book where the main cast of characters are not sure who the traitor is. Is it this newly introduced Eben? Is it Giltharnas? Is it possibly even Raistlin? And whilst I quite liked the back and forth of wondering who the traitor was, I was a bit disappointed to discover it was, in the end, Eben. It felt like he had been introduced solely so that he could be the traitor and the other main characters could get away scot-free, which just wasn't as interesting as it could have been. The most interesting outcome in my mind would have been actually if Raistlin was the traitor. I feel this is probably a bit out of character, particularly as he's going to develop over coming books. But it would have been a really interesting character twist, particularly if he then had to redeem himself over the rest of the series. But instead we had Eben introduced and then written out quite quickly, and it all felt a bit of a cop-out. And I felt a little bit the same about the final battle. We have a fight between these two dragons. We have Ember, who is the enemy dragon, and then we have Flamestrike, who is working for the enemy but turns against Ember and kills him. Now, the fight is very dramatic. I didn't have a problem with that. But again, Flamestrike is perhaps introduced a little bit too conveniently to take Ember out. We have no mention of her up until the closing chapters of the book, and whilst I did like her very brief arc, it did slightly once again feel a bit Deus Ex Machina. She was dropped into the story to solve a problem, but that left the main characters perhaps having less to do than they would have otherwise. Finally, one more character death to cover, and that is Fizban. In the very last page of the book, we see Tasselhoff picking a white feather out of the air, which is sort of implying that Fizban is not dead. I had already guessed at that really, because his death felt a little bit inconsequential. It happens kind of off camera, as it were, so I would be very surprised if we don't see him again in later books. We also now have the mystery of the Everman. Now, this is an interesting one. It felt a little bit tacked on at the end of the book, but it is just compelling enough that I really do want to know where it's leading. Essentially, we have this character who seems to be impossible to kill, who seems to be preoccupied with something to the point where he looks like he's mad, and we really don't know much more about him apart from the fact that he just turns up again at the end of the book after everyone thinks he's dead. So I'm interested to see where that plot line is going to go. I suspect it's going to be quite a big part of later books in the trilogy. And finally, I just wanted to talk about some of my favourite characters. I often do pick female characters in fantasy books, but I'm afraid I can't do that this time. Our main female characters are Goldmoon, Tika and Lorana. Now, Tika and Lorana are really not in the book that much. They're introduced mainly in the second half when they become part of the group. I did enjoy Goldmoon's story, I have to say, but it felt like it was wrapped up and completed by the end of the first book. Tika and Lorana, though, definitely have a lot of growing to do. I will admit I found both of them a little bit irritating in this book. I suspect they're going to become really interesting and integral characters later in the story, but that was not really the case in this particular book. My favourite characters then were Tanis, who really is the lead in Dragons of Autumn Twilight. I would say the ending of this book does not resolve very much for him personally. It feels like a lot of issues to do with his heritage and even his love life are very much up in the air. So I don't know if he's going to take centre stage in the other two books in the trilogy, but I suspect he will. My other favourite character has to be Tasselhoff. Now, he's very much introduced as comic relief through a lot of the book, but I really enjoyed his scenes. He was great fun to be around, and whilst his race, the Kenda, do seem to be based on hobbits, there's a much sharper edge to them. A lot of humour. They're also quite cunning, they don't feel fear, so Tasselhoff was just so much fun to read about. Interestingly, I did think there was a growing thread of seriousness in his character by the end of the book, and I really enjoyed that. I think there could be quite a lot of growth for him in the future, and we have already seen that, which I absolutely loved. I do like it when a comic relief character gets a chance to save the day. So once again, I really enjoyed the book overall. The story as a whole has such a great mix of action and fast-paced movement, also humour, but there's also a real sense of a mythic history and depth to this world, which is quite hard to pull off in the first book in a series. I can already tell there is so much more to come even in this trilogy alone, and I'm very much looking forward to getting further into it. So if you have read any Dragonlance recently or back when it first came out, please tell me your thoughts. Perhaps this is one of your favourite classic fantasy books of the 80s, or perhaps you think there are much better Dragonlance books waiting for me further down the line. Please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I am hoping to get to book 2 very soon and to continue beyond that trilogy as well. I have started looking into buying some of the secondhand paperbacks of books later in the series that are not easily available online. Some of them, I have to say, are surprisingly expensive, so watch this space. So I will be back soon with more videos in this series. Until then, keep reading everyone, and I'll see you next time.